In episode 1, you heard me ponder about how truth regarding the Kennedy assassination remains elusive and how, as a nation, we remain puzzled as to why elements within the government have seemingly continued vested interest in the withholding of information about the assassination. Information withheld that implies just one thing: that somebody likely knows more about what really happened and why. Even though there's no one functioning in the government today who was part of the government then. It's beyond the reasoning of trusting citizens to determine just why this has occurred, but we get a real glimpse of the possible reasons at the start of episode 2, when the economist James Galbraith, in his own essay on the assassination, helps us to open our eyes to the real ways in which the world works and the real ways in which the power structures at work in our society ensure that truths like the Kennedy assassination are kept cloaked. These structures work just like the forces of gravity, preventing the truth from catapulting forward once it is uncovered. The explanation given by Galbraith in episode 2 should open our eyes to the simple and powerful tools that are deployed, and which cause Galbraith to point out that all of it contributes to the real culprit: complicity of the Fourth Estate in this country. The weakness of a free press to ferret out the truth through honest discourse and investigation, and then proclaim it widely. As a reminder, Galbraith pointed out the basic technique was not secrecy. It was confusion, incoherence, misdirection, and irrelevance at an epic scale. But there is one more technique that weighs disproportionate when assessing the gravitational impact of these elements on the truth. Combining all of those things with a culture of exclusion. What did he mean by that? Well, to survive in American public life ever since has required adhesion to the Warren Commission story. Anything else, and one is relegated to a side stage in the power structures of this country. Think about these forces like you think about gravity. As I sat down to finish completion of the third and final episode with Doug, we were presented with a perfect example of just what we were saying about the failure of the Fourth Estate. All of the major networks and even C-SPAN failed to cover the second public hearing where Doug Horne and others testified so eloquently and exposed the truth so clearly. Only Forbes and the Aftermath seemed brave enough to put it out there. But wait. The article that landed on my desk validated once again that others see the same thing so clearly. What am I talking about? Well, yesterday, June 16th, an article appeared before me that came from an online magazine entitled An American Thinker. It was written by Alan Favish, and it was entitled The Media's Failure to Effectively Confront Recent JFK Assassination Testimony. Curious, aren't you, as to which way they're going with this? Well, I'll read excerpts from it now. The news media have failed again. Go to your favorite news sources to find accurate coverage of the May 20th, 2025 congressional hearing on the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy. You'll find that the overwhelming majority of news organizations ignored the hearing. It is common for establishment news organizations to dismiss rational inquiry about JFK's assassination by use of the phrase, and I quote, conspiracy theory. The article goes on to state that conspiracy theory is widely used as a pejorative term. An effect of this usage, however, is to discourage certain kinds of legitimate critical inquiry. In a world where conspiracies happen, it is reasonable to seek to formulate good theories of what exactly is happening. And through competent investigation, hypothesis of conspiracy can sometimes be verified. Thus, the general denigration of conspiracy theory tends to discourage a kind of practice that there is reason, in fact, to encourage. The article goes on to make its most powerful and poignant statement about the stunning facts that were reiterated at the second hearing meeting, part of which was delivered by Doug Horne himself. Oh, and lest I forget, The article identifies Doug Horne as the most important witness that gave testimony during the hearing, pointing out the riveting discussion around the evidence involving surgical alteration of Kennedy's body performed at Bethesda Naval Hospital, inciting many other facts that the news media over the years has failed to report on, most of which are outlined in our audio appendix. Summing things up in a way that all of us can understand, the article says this about the testimony. Rather than being ignored or dismissed as a conspiracy theory, the facts alleged at the House hearing deserve detailed, accurate evaluation, and thereafter, either detailed, accurate refutation or support or further evaluation. Well, in this final analysis, all I can say is amen. My prayer for the truth was answered by the men who have spoken the truth at the House hearings and by the tiny seeds of freedom that have been sown in the press by the likes of Forbes and the writings of men like Galbraith and Favish on the topic of the JFK assassination. And hats off to the courageous young Congresswoman who helped to create the venue in which the witnesses spoke, and the official sanction of that dialogue, a sanction that comes naturally with the venue. The truth may very well be close to the light of day. James Galbraith leans left. The American Thinker and its writers lean right. Both hit the nail on the head, and together they reinforce the fact that the truth in the Kennedy assassination is not about partisan thoughts or partisan politics. It is about the truth, and it's about keeping this experiment in democracy alive. Doug Horne served on the staff of the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board, or ARRB, for the final 3 years of its 4-year lifespan, specifically from August of 1995 through September of 1998. He was initially hired as a senior analyst on the military records team. In early 1997, he was promoted to head that very same team, serving as chief analyst for military records until the ARRB concluded its work on September 30th, 1998. During his tenure, he was responsible for securing the declassification and public release of military records related to Cuba and Vietnam policy. He worked extensively in the medical evidence arena and served as the ARRB's point man on issues related to the Zapruder film, the film of President Kennedy's assassination. Doug also served as the principal research assistant to the ARRB's General Counsel, Jeremy Gunn, in preparation for and conducting 10 depositions of participants and witnesses to JFK's autopsy. He was present at all 10 of those depositions. Doug later authored a 5-volume memoir titled Inside the Assassination Records Review Board, detailing his personal conclusions regarding the medical evidence and how the ARRB's work enhanced understanding of the assassination. He maintains a YouTube channel at Douglas Horne, JFK Assassination, and that channel features detailed presentations on his conclusions regarding the JFK medical evidence and how President Kennedy was killed. The ARRB was allowed to conduct depositions even though it was not empowered to reinvestigate the assassination or generate conclusions or findings of fact. The board chose to attempt to, and I quote, clarify the record of certain aspects of the assassination, which allowed it to conduct such depositions. This aim led them to taking depositions from 10 individuals involved in or present at President John F. Kennedy's autopsy, and later an additional joint deposition of 5 Dallas treating physicians. Doug Horne served as the principal research assistant for these depositions, and he was present at all 10 autopsy-related ones. Doug Horne's conduct while working for the ARRB is nothing short of an act of courage. He took actions to learn more in the face of stiff resistance. The ARRB was not empowered to further investigate the JFK assassination, yet it was the work of Doug Horne and Jeremy Gunn, the ARRB's general counsel, who, more than any other persons during that time frame or even before, it was their work that advanced the official understanding of the autopsy and all of its mysteries. And because it was Doug Horne who wrote a 5-volume memoir largely about the medical evidence and the context and significance of the ARRB's depositions, that his work now towers above everyone else's, including that of Jeremy Gunn, who it appears has made a conscious decision not to write about the ARRB's depositions or the JFK medical evidence. It's an honor to have Doug Horne here today on our program and to learn more about what he has begun to tell of this incredible story that is the JFK autopsy and the Zapruder film. For sure. Well, we're coming along here. We've actually gone through most of what we have here. Would you like to comment more on, the X-rays were obviously a problem too. Would you like to say more than you already have?
Yes.
And you talked about the 6 and 3 being missing, and then the other 3 having some form of potential problems.
Right. There, Dr. Mantic interviewed Dr. Ebersol before Ebersol died. He interviewed him twice, and Mantic recorded the second one on a tape recorder. Thank God, because Ebersol died. He cut him off in the middle of the conversation and refused to talk anymore. And then Ebersol died. But Mantic did say to him, "So you would confirm to me today that there were 6 skull X-rays exposed?" And Ebersol just said yes. He didn't even hesitate. He just said yes. Well, there's only 3 in the official record. Okay. And so the lead X-ray technician, Gerald Custer, who was working with Edward Reed, Gerald Custer, over the years, has given differing accounts, but most of his early accounts say there were 5 or 6. And then by the time he got to his review board deposition years later, he said, well, there were 5. But 2 of the ones missing, because there's only 3 now that exist, he said were oblique views of the hole in the head. So they would have been shot at an angle from both directions. So in other words, you would not have been able to hide a big blowout cavity in the rear of the cranium in those X-rays. And that would be why they would have been taken at an oblique angle. And so the ones that survive are the lateral views, just views of the right side of the head and the left side of the head. And one frontal view survives, anterior, posterior. So Dr. Mantic, I didn't mention this before, but this is his main claim to fame. He visited the archives 9 different times before the Kennedy family finally decided, you're banned, you can't come anymore. But they let him visit 9 times. And he examined the X-rays a lot with a machine called an optical densitometer, which studies the amount of light coming through the film, through the developed film. And he made hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of empirical data measurements of what the optical density readings were on different parts of each of the 3 surviving X-rays. And because he's a radiation oncologist, he knows that you can determine the density of tissue by studying these OD measurements. And it's very complicated. They're logarithmic readings. You have to understand logarithmic numbers. And he explains all this in some of his books and in his lectures. And so he concluded many years ago that the 2 X-rays of the side of President Kennedy's head, the lateral X-rays, which you will see in my documentary, the JFK skull X-rays, you'll see the images the archives published. The images of the side of the skull, the X-ray images, show a big white, they show a big white patch covering up the rear of the head, covering up the right rear of the head behind the ear canal, a big white patch, which is unusually bright. So on the unenhanced X-rays, it's so bright that you can't really see any detail. It's like that part of the x-ray is overexposed. And then you look at the enhanced version made by the HSCA through a contractor in 1978. You can see the white patch has borders on it, and it's a specific area of the skull.
Wow.
It's
Wow.
the right rear of the head, exactly where the Dallas doctors said there was an exit wound. How about that? And so then Mantic looked at the AP x-ray, the front to back with his machine, and there's a bullet fragment that it looks like it's in, when you look at the x-ray, it looks like the bullet fragment's in Kennedy's eye. It's a circle. It's almost a complete cross. It's supposed to be a cross section of a bullet from the middle of a bullet, although no bullet ever acted like that. But that's what Larry Sturdivant said, an HSCA firearms expert. He said, no bullet ever acted like that, where the only fragment left behind was a cross section from the middle of the bullet. It's either always the nose or the tail.
Right.
So, and that's unusually dense and bright. And it's the brightest thing in that x-ray. And he determined that it's too bright. And then he decided, wait a minute. This is so bright that it implies metal. It implies metal that's so dense that it would be more dense than all of JFK's fillings combined. So Mantic had the original x-ray, and he could x-ray all of Kennedy's dental fillings, his dental amalgams, at the same time through his teeth. And this so-called bullet fragment is even more density. It allows more light through than those things. So he knew, well, this is a problem. Because if you look at the lateral x-rays taken from the side, this thing on the frontal x-ray, that it looks like it's in the right orbit, but it's supposed to be on the back of the head. Okay, it's supposed to be a fragment that got sliced off and from a bullet and stayed on the back of the head. When you look at the side views, the lateral views, the corresponding object is less than the size of a pencil point. It should be very wide, very big, very thick, and very dense and very bright. And it almost doesn't exist at all. So it's like, wait a minute. So then he went back and looked with a magnifying glass through the bright, what looks like a metal fragment in the orbit of JFK's eye, which is supposed to be on the back of his head. And he can see the little tiny pencil point fragment that's really on the head. He can see it in the middle of the image. It's a double exposure. So somebody cut a hole in a piece of cardboard and created a template, and they light blasted this part of the AP skull x-ray to create a fake bullet fragment. It's just an optical illusion. But they forgot to alter the other x-rays. They're idiots. This is a cover-up that can't shoot straight. These people are clowns. And so when you look at the lateral x-rays, and this is in my documentary, the JFK skull x-rays, I explain his findings. You can see this thing on the back of the head. It's very tiny. You can barely see it. It bears no resemblance to this massive, dense object, which you see on the frontal x-ray. Therefore, it's fake. And so he's determined this forgery, that the three surviving, Dr. Mantic has determined that the three extant skull x-rays are not only copy films, they're not originals, but they're altered copy films. And he's identified the portions where they were altered. So here's the rest of the story. The other doctor, which Mantic got into the archives, he, introduced Mike Chesser to the Kennedy family attorney and said, encouraged him to apply. You need to encourage him to apply. And I think he helped sponsor him somehow. Dr. Chesser discovered the parts of the skull x-rays that are not altered, which is the whole forehead on the lateral x-ray. The forehead is not altered, and neither is the temporal bone around the ear. They're not altered, believe me. Or Mantic.
And how do you know that? Or how does Dr. Chesser know that? Tell the audience.
Because he replicated Dr. Mantic's optical density measurements, the hundreds of measurements. He replicated them on both the original skull x-rays in the archives, the unenhanced ones. He also took optical density, something Mantic had not done. He took optical density readings of the JF Kennedy 1960 skull x-ray at the Kennedy Library in Boston. So he determined that there's nothing abnormal about the optical density readings in the temple and in the forehead. Not only do they not look like they've been light blasted, they look normal, but the optical density, the numbers say they haven't been altered. Plus, there's no white patch and extremely bright area on the JFK skull x-ray from 1960, like there is on the postmortem x-rays. So those two look very different. and they have very similar they have very dissimilar optical density readings. So the optical density readings of the JFK skull X-ray from 1960 are what you would expect from a normal brain, and they're not real bright, and they don't indicate metal or very dense bone. They just look normal. But the optical density readings, this is the end of the story. The optical density readings for the lateral X-rays from the autopsy, which look so bright behind the ear and the right rear of the head, they are so bright that they imply a density of bone so bright that it's almost as bright as the petrous bone. So the petrous bone is the one between your ears. It's the densest bone in the body, and it kind of goes straight across. It's almost straight across. And it's the densest bone in the body. So the white patch, what Mantic insists is a fraudulent patch photographically imposed on the original X-ray. The white patch is so dense based on the optical densitometry that it implies a very dense bone that Kennedy would have had to almost have had a bonehead with no brain in it, solid bone. And then it's almost as dense as the petrous bone. And so it's just absurd. So that's what that presentation is about. It's not only about me talking about the autopsy photographs and what's wrong with them. It's me talking about it's not only me talking about Dealey Plaza locations for headshots, but it's mostly Mantic and Chesser talking about their work. So why are the 3 surviving skull X-rays? Why do I say they're forgeries? Because the 2 doctors say they are. And where are they altered? We can show you exactly, and I've shown you exactly where they're altered and where they're not. So Dr. Chesser examines the right temple, which is not altered, and the forehead, which is not altered, and he finds the entrance wound in the right temple, and he finds the entrance wound high in the forehead. And not only that, this is the really disturbing part of the story that I want to explain now. It's my last chance to do so here. If you look at the lateral skull X-rays, the side views of the skull X-rays published by the House committee, you'll see a fragment trail from the vicinity of the forehead bullet that goes up and back. But you don't see it start where it really starts at the forehead bullet. You don't see the metallic snowstorm of tiny, 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 tiny dust-like fragments, 30 or 40 fragments that begin near the entrance wound, and then the fragments get bigger and bigger as the fragment trail goes up in the head. So all you see is the middle and the second half of the fragment trail in the X-ray that they published. But Dr. Chesser says, oh no, au contraire. If you go look at that unenhanced skull X-ray, the right lateral, in person at the archives, which you cannot see because of deed of gift suppression, you will see a complete fragment trail, which begins with a metallic snowstorm right where the bullet entered. And then the snowstorm, the particles start to get bigger and bigger, and then they get even bigger. And the fragments with the largest mass travel the farther. But all the tiny ones that are always adjacent to an entrance wound, when you have a frangible bullet entering a body, when you have a hunting bullet or an exploding bullet entering a body that's not a full metal jacket, when it begins to disintegrate, which is immediately, it leaves a metal snowstorm. So he said you can see that in person, and you cannot see it on the X-rays published in the report. Not only that, but the House committee produced, as I said, these enhancements of the 3 skull X-rays to make them easier to interpret, because there's too much contrast in them. They're very hard to interpret. So they did enhancements, and the enhancements show the entry wound in the forehead and the beginning of the fragment trail whited out with what looks like crude whiteout. So, and he says, but if you look at the enhanced X-ray in the archives, the entrance wound is not whited out. It's only whited out in the version the House committee published. So I want to make this clear. And if this doesn't get you to watch my documentary, I don't know what will. So there's fraud perpetrated by the HSCA establishment. Some senior person, 2 people come to mind, likely possibilities, and I talk about their names in the presentation. Somebody at a high level decided, okay, when we publish these images of the lateral X-ray, the unenhanced one, we're going to block out the beginning of the middle snowstorm. We don't want that fragment trail to be connected with this entry wound in the forehead. We don't want anybody to see the entry wound in the forehead. We want them to think that fragment trail started from behind and went forward. But actually, Chesser says no. The middle snowstorm shows the fragment trail started here and went up and back because the small particles are deposited first. And that's what they blacked out. But then on the enhanced image of the same X-ray, the enhanced image, they've whited out the entry wound in the forehead. They've whited out two large metal fragments, which were on either side of the entry wound. I mean, large metal fragments. They've whited them out. They've whited out the entry wound itself, and they've whited out the beginning of the metal snowstorm. So this is why the deed of gift has to be removed. If it's removed, you know, providing Dr. Chesser's telling me the truth, he saw these things twice on two different visits, and he's seen the enhanced versions also. So I trust the man impeccably.
This
is the big cover-up story that it continued during the HSCA. It's terrible.
Just on that note, on the sort of the snowstorm of metal particles, I know that Gerald Custer has made some inconsistent statements over time, but as I recall in his testimony, he did indicate that was present on the X-ray. Is that not true? I mean,
I don't recall. I don't, sitting here today, I don't recall whether he recalled a metal snowstorm or not. I think he recalled a fragment trail, but I don't know if he recalled the beginning of the fragment trail, seeing the beginning of it. But Mantic recalls seeing it too at the archives.
Well, which obviously the more refined view by the doctors indicates the direction of the shot, which is
so
really
here's the crime in all this. You talk about federal obstruction and deceit, which is the title of this hearing. Why didn't the Clark panel describe the entrance wound in the forehead? And why didn't they describe plain as nose on your face, the entrance wound in the right temple? If I can see them today, why didn't they describe them? Why didn't the House Select Committee, the vaunted forensic pathology panel, describe the entrance wound in the forehead and the entrance wound in the right temple? I wonder if these people only looked at reproductions of the skull X-rays on big poster boards, because that's what the HSCA used at their hearings. They used the big poster boards of the skull X-rays, which are the ones they published in their report, which are the ones that have been messed with. Okay. I wonder how many of the people on the vaunted forensic pathology panel actually went to the archives and examined the original skull X-rays and had a chance to see the metallic snowstorm and the entrance wound and the entrance wound in the right temple. There's a clue that somebody important did see the entrance wound in the right temple, and that's during the HSCA deposition of Dr. Ebersol, the radiologist at the autopsy. So Michael Baden, the eminence grise in all this, I think, the number one suspect. That's my own. That exhausts my knowledge of French. Eminence grise, yes. So he was showing the lateral X-ray, and there's a big break in the bone up in the back of the head. It's a big dislocated skull fracture, and that dislocated fracture in the upper back of the head. That's what the Clark panel said was the entrance wound in the back of the head. And they said that because it roughly matches the location of the red spot in an autopsy photograph. But it's a red spot that nobody saw at the autopsy. So that's a problem just because it's in a photograph. But because the red spot was in a photo, the radiologist for the Clark panel said, okay, I'm going to look for something in the skull X-ray that might match the red spot, you know, and he discovered this break in the bone. And then he went and described it as the entrance wound with no doubt whatsoever. And then Michael Baden decided he liked that. So he and his entire panel endorsed that finding of the Clark panel as the entrance wound in the back of the head is high in the back of the head, which it isn't. The real entrance wound is low in the back of the head. The review board had 3 consultants look at the autopsy materials on different dates so they wouldn't contaminate each other's opinions. All 3 of them said that break in the skull in the upper back of the head is not an entrance wound. And the one whose testimony meant the most was Dr. Fitzpatrick, who was a forensic radiologist. He scoffed at the idea that that was an entrance wound. He said, that's just a dislocated fracture. Okay. So then the question is, why didn't these people see the entrance wound high in the forehead? And why didn't they see the entrance wound in the right temple? And why didn't they note the real location of the entrance wound, which was in the back of the head, which is low? And so this is where we fall back on the Gary Aguilar's theory of a confirmation bias. They're working for the government. These people are all working for the government, even for the executive branch, the Ramsey-Clark panel, or the judicial, the congressional branch, the HSCA, Forensic Pathology Panel, was working for Congress, but that's still part of the government. So were they asleep at the switch, is what I'm asking? Or were they only reporting what they wanted them to report? Were they actually part of a cover-up? Were they part of a cover-up? Were they read in on a cover-up and said, you must do this? Especially the House Select Committee. Dr. Morgan on the Clark panel is one guy, but there were 9 people on the forensic panel. Were they told that you have to support the finding of a lone assassin only from behind, shooting from behind, to support the Warren Commission because it's in the interest of national security and institutional faith? Or were they just asleep at the switch? Were they just old guys showing up late for meetings, which they did, unprepared, which they did? And did you not really look at the real x-rays? And did you only look at poster boards, the ones you put up at your public hearings in 1978? So those are questions that are not answered. These guys have a lot to answer for, because when this is the end of the story, when Dr. Michael Bodden, the head of the forensic pathology panel, had Dr. Ebersol testifying under oath with the lateral x-ray in front of him, he said, where is the exit room? I'm sorry, you're going to have to edit this out.
I'll take it. I will.
Dr. Bodden asked Dr. Ebersol, where is the entrance wound in this lateral skull x-ray? Where do you see the entrance wound? And we know what Dr. Bodden expected Ebersol to say if he'd been a team player. He would have said, oh, it's this break up high in the back of the skull, the one that identified by the Clark panel. He didn't say that. I got the audio of that. It's the longest pause I've ever heard during a deposition. And there were a lot with Dr. Humes, and he was trying to figure out what to say. But Dr. Ebersol paused and paused and paused, and I wondered, is there something wrong with the recording? And finally he said, that shot would have come from the right. I know why he said that. He's looking at the right temple. He's looking at the right temporal entrance wound.
Yeah.
It's a shot from the right front. And that's why he said that. And boy, they did not like that. Michael Bodden did not like that. And 3 or 4 people on the HSCA panel proceeded to attack his credentials. And so that was really interesting, because the HSCA suppressed his entire deposition transcript. We knew they took it. They didn't publish it, and they tried to seal it for 50 years. And they failed because the JFK Records Act forced them to release his deposition transcript. So part of the transcript says, I think I see an entrance wound of a shot from the right. Ha ha. And he also looks at the back of the head photos, and he said, under oath, he told the House committee, well, this picture, he's looking at the intact back of the head picture. He says the wound in this picture is too superior and it's too lateral. In other words, the wound is too much on the top of the head and the right side. He said, I remember more of a gaping occipital wound, which would be the back of the head. He said that under oath. So what do? They suppressed his testimony for 50 years, and they didn't get away with it. So it was released in 1993 in accordance with the JFK Records Act. So this is the end of my supplementary comments on the skull x-rays. And so a part of each image is altered, part of them are not. I explained this in my presentation. I think you can have confidence in that. And I think you can have confidence of Dr. Chesser finding the entrance wound high in the forehead and finding the entrance wound in the right temple. And because the entrance wound in the right temple, you can also see all that damage in the front to back x-ray. In the frontal x-ray, from the AP x-ray, you can see a lot of damage in this area also when you're looking from front to rear. You can also see it from the side. You don't see any damage on the left side of the face, on the left side of the skull. The left temple doesn't look damaged in the AP skull x-ray. So his findings on the right temporal entry wound, I think, are very firm. And I'll just say one final thing about that. There's one other indication we should have confidence in that. So Jim Jenkins, the Navy corpsman I mentioned earlier, remembers during the autopsy, Doctors Humes and Fink in particular examining a lesion in the right temple, a wound. And Dr. Fink saying, this is discolored, it's gray, so this discoloration could be lead from the bullet. So they're looking at a lesion, a bullet wound in the scalp in the right temple. And at that point, Jenkins says that Dr. Humes was called over to the gallery by generals and admirals, and there was a muted discussion. And he came back, and all the examination of the right temple stopped. And Humes said to his colleagues, it's time to move on to the back of the head. So rather than examine this fully and see if Dr. Fink was right, and maybe this is a bullet wound in the right temple, Humes came back after being called over to the gallery and said, it's time to move on to the back of the head. That's what's going on at the autopsy. It's disgusting. The American people deserve to know what really happened 62 years later. And Mike Chesser latched onto this, and he did a lot of research about how bullets disintegrate as soon as they enter the skull. The middle snowstorm begins right upon entry. He did all that research in forensic textbooks. He did research on something called bullet wipe. And this discoloration Fink would have seen at the entry wound near the right ear in the right temple. That's what Chesser calls bullet wipe. And he said bullet wipe is soot from the barrel of the gun, and it's only deposited in the body when the bullet enters. It's not deposited where the bullet exits. So the fact that Dr. Fink saw gray discoloration in the right temple and thought it might have been lead from a bullet, Dr. Chesser is saying that's bullet wipe. And I think this is conclusive evidence that this lesion in the bone here is an entrance wound, and it's the proximate cause almost certainly for the blowout seen at Parkland Hospital. So there's a lot to study in the x-rays, and I think it's a fascinating subject, and you can do it on my YouTube channel.
We're going to do it. We're all going to do it. Maybe more than once for sure, because I think to actually understand it, you really have to continue to bear down on the evidence. It takes more than just a single look at any of this. We've all been doing it for years and years and years. With this, fantastic. Do you want to? Do you have enough energy to finish with a little bit about Gawlers?
Sure, sure I do. Yeah.
All right, good. Let's do that, because I think I'm coming over here. I think that's.
So look, I two or three things to say about Gawlers. Initially, I've studied the Army file on the state funeral of John F. Kennedy. It's in the JFK library. And so you can get it online. It's it's 130 some pages or something. And so early on, the plans were to take the body directly to Gawlers and just embalm it, and restore it and embalm it, reconstruct it, fix the wounds and embalm it, and prepare the president for burial, for probably an open casket funeral, maybe. And then they, reality kicked in and they realized, oh, okay, there has to be an autopsy first. Duh. So then the Secret Service, I know this from the Air Force One tapes, I've written about it too. The Secret Service overrules the desires on the airplane. So the desires of Kennedy's Army aide, General Ted Clifton, and Admiral Berkeley, even though he was Navy, Admiral Berkeley of the Navy, military physician to the president, and General Clifton, they wanted the autopsy at Walter Reed Hospital. I know why they did that. The Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, a building full of experts, was co-located with Walter Reed when Walter Reed was downtown at that location. So that made sense. The Secret Service overruled that desire, and they instructed Air Force One, and they instructed Roy Kellerman of the Secret Service, no. The autopsy will be at Bethesda, and the body's going to go there by helicopter. You wanted it to go to Walter Reed by a mortuary ambulance, which is a hearse. But no, it's going to go by helicopter and it's going to be at Bethesda, case closed. That's it. We decided we're the White House, we're the Situation Room. This was Gerald Bain relaying these decisions.
The Secret Service. Yeah.
The Secret Service. So then the Army puts in its, listen to this, and then I'll get back to Gallers. The Army puts in its report, okay, so the body was going to be transferred by helicopter to Bethesda first, instead of directly to Gallers. And the Army says, this is in a written document. The Army says, we provided an estimate to Rear Admiral Galloway. Now, Galloway's in charge of the whole Bethesda Naval Complex, the treatment hospital and the medical school. We notified him at 5:30 that the airplane's going to land at 6 and that the helicopter transportation of JFK's body is going to arrive at 1830 hours. They use the military times, 1830. That's 6:30 p.m. That was their precise estimate an hour beforehand. Well, they should have known. They knew when Air Force One was going to land. They knew that. It was discussed on the air, on the Air Force One tapes. The pilots had reported that we're going to land at 6 o'clock, and they did land at 6 o'clock. So guess what? The estimated time of arrival at Bethesda in a helicopter is 5 minutes before the shipping casket arrives in a hearse, as documented by the Boysen report. So the Army funeral file perfectly dovetails with the Boysen report in terms of the ETA of the helicopter and the actual time of arrival of the casket in the Boysen report. Because Paul O'Connor, the Navy corpsman, said, I heard a helicopter land way behind Bethesda, probably in the O Club parking lot, the Officers Club parking lot. And he told William Law, author William Law, about 5 minutes later, the shipping casket is brought in. Oh, really? So that matches up that 1830 estimate by the Army. The helicopter is going to arrive at 1830 with the 1835 arrival time in the Boysen report. It matches. So who does the hearse belong to? I'm sure it belongs to the Galler Funeral Home. They were originally ordered by Colonel Miller, who's part of the Army Death Watch, ordered by him to send a black hearse, ground transportation for a casket, to send a hearse to Andrews Air Force Base. At the last minute, that was rescinded. That order was rescinded. And what Gallers never admitted to us, but I'm sure it's the truth, their supervisor lied his eyes out to us. That's my assessment to Mr. Joe Hagan. I don't mind saying that today. So he lied his eyes out, and he tried to say that I didn't get there until about 11 o'clock at night to Bethesda. And that maybe Tom Robinson went with me, or maybe some other people went with him, but I didn't get there till 11.
Presumably toward the implying they didn't get there until the end of the autopsy. Yeah.
So wait a minute. So then we interviewed Tom Robinson, and he said, "Oh no, I arrived really early that night at the morgue, and I went with Mr. Hagan, and so obviously they went in their own hearse." I'm telling you, that's the Galler's hearse, the black hearse that Dennis David unloaded at 6:35 per the Boysen report. So Tom Robinson of Galler's told the truth when he says, no, I went there very early that night with Mr. Hagan. So we sprung a document on Mr. Hagan when he appeared before us. We had to subpoena him or he wouldn't talk to us. We sprung a document on him called the Galler's first call sheet, and it had been not provided to us by him. He was supposed to provide all documents related to what they did that night. And he didn't bring 3 of them. He didn't bring he didn't bring 3. And one of them was a receipt for the Dallas casket, in which Gallers turned it over to GSA in 1964. They gave it back to GSA. He didn't turn over the first call sheet and some other document. So we had gotten them from researchers, and the interesting thing is he didn't want us to see them. That's my conclusion. So guess what the first call sheet says? It's written by different handwriting by different people, and there's a key entry 2/3 of the way down the page, and it says, JFK removed from metal shipping casket at USNS, U.S. Naval Hospital, Bethesda. JFK removed from metal shipping casket. So we asked him, you didn't bring this. He said, well, I think it was an inside job. I think one of my people gave it or sold it to a researcher. He said, then he lied and said, I'm really glad you brought it with you. Yeah, right. I know you're glad. Because to him, the whole subject of caskets was radioactive. He didn't want to talk about caskets at all. So we finally said, who wrote this entry? JFK removed from metal shipping casket. And he said, that's my handwriting. Okay. If that's, oops, wait a minute. I'm sorry. I hope my sound is okay now.
Yeah, it's good. It's good.
Okay. Well, it was a little funky for about the last 40 minutes, and I think that plug was half pulled out of my microphone.
I did hear. Yeah.
Was it okay? Did
yeah,
sound okay?
it was fine. Yeah,
Okay,
it was not intrusive at all.
So here's the point. If he wrote that entry, metal shipping casket, JFK removed from metal shipping casket at U.S. Naval Hospital, and he wrote it in his handwriting. And we know the shipping casket was delivered at 6:35 p.m. per Dennis David and Donald Robintish and per the Bojan report. Then that means he lied about 11 o'clock and he was there at 6:35. And that means he and Robinson were the two people in the black hearse that drove up early. And that's why Robinson saw things happening to Kennedy's skull that nobody saw at the autopsy after 8 o'clock. He saw the skull. Robinson saw the skull, saw it open to get the brain out. He told that to the House committee. He told that to us. He told the same thing to both groups. His wound diagram of a hole in the back of the head was the same for the House committee and the same for us, except that he drew ours on an anatomical template from a textbook. And then he clarified everything for us by saying, oh no, that autopsy photo, the top of the head all gone. He said, that's not what the bullet did. That's what the doctors did. Well, he had to know. He was there watching. So the Gawler story is that the first call sheet documents a shipping casket and that Kennedy's body was removed from it. And the Bojan report provides the time for that. And so what Hagen didn't tell us, he didn't tell us the rest of the story, which was that after we were told not to go to Andrews with the hearse, that we were told to go to Bethesda instead and meet a helicopter at the Officers Club parking lot. That has to be what happened. So at any rate, so
Doug, can I ask a question? I mean, this has been one of this. This is certainly very, very consistent with, I think, what so many of us have wondered about and thought, may have been an explanation for what had gone on that evening. But take it a step back. At some point, there had to be there had to be a separation of the body from transport. I mean, how did that happen if there was a thought that the body originally was in the original bronze casket? At what point, do you have any theory on when you think that separation occurred and how?
Yeah, there are only two possibilities. Okay, can you still hear me? I'm checking on my sound here.
Oh yeah, you're fine.
Okay. So the reason you asked that question, the audience needs to understand this, is that if you believe JFK's body arrived at 1835 hours, 6:35 p.m. per Dennis David, Donald Robintish, and the Bojan report, and Dr. Boswell, who said that was him. If you believe that, then that means that the Dallas casket, the ornate bronze, dark chocolate colored, dark brown, 400-pound bronze casket that was removed from the airplane on national TV at 5 minutes after 6, once the plane rolled to a stop, that casket had to be empty when it pulled up. At least it doesn't have Kennedy's body in it when it pulls up in front of Bethesda at 6:55. So remember the sequence here. This is the reason for your question. I understand the reason, but I want the audience to understand the reason. If Kennedy's body arrives at 6:35 p.m., then Doesn't it mean Kennedy's body cannot be in the Dallas casket that pulls up 20 minutes later? Yes, that's exactly what it means. Of course, that's what it means. So then your question is, so when was it removed from that casket and placed elsewhere on the airplane? So there were only two possibilities. And I'm going to give the really short version here because there is some ambiguity and uncertainty involved here. And you can adopt either viewpoint, and there are reasons to adopt either viewpoint and to overrule the other one. So the David Lifton version was always that, in his book, was that, of course, Kennedy was in the Dallas casket, brought on board at 2:14 p.m. And at 2:18 p.m., that casket was on board. They almost dropped it, taking it up the stairs. It was very heavy, but they got it up there. And then Jackie went on board right afterwards. And at 2:18 p.m. at Love Field, that casket and Jackie and everybody who's going to fly was on board. And Judge Hughes doesn't arrive until 2:30 p.m. And the swearing in is at 2:38. And the plane takes off at 2:47. So there's a new aspect to the Air Force One tapes. So the new version was released in 2012, the Clifton version. There's more on those Air Force One recordings than was on the version released earlier by the LBJ library. So the Clifton tapes from 2012, Air Force One radio conversations. On that tape, Roy Kellerman's talking to the head of the White House Situation Room. Here's that name again, Gerald Bain, the guy that changed the autopsy to Bethesda and said, we're going to go by helicopter. And Kellerman tells Jerry Bain, everybody is on board. Well, that means he's saying that at 2:18 p.m. or afterwards. That's when everybody was on board. Jackie went up the ladder after the heavy casket. He said, everybody's on board, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, we're all waiting for the judge for the swearing in. Well, that means they're talking before 2:30 because the judge arrives at 2:30. So this phone call that I'm about to reference, it's a crucial phone call. It's a clue. It's a serious clue in a murder case, in a chain of custody case. So he says, everybody's on board. And then he says, we're waiting for the judge. And then Roy Kellerman says, I'm going to have to call you back after the body. And then he hangs up. I'm going to have to call you back after the body. So that goes unexplained, but it's very provocative because Lifton's had always assumed in his book that Kennedy was in the Dallas casket at 2:14 when it went on board, that his body was removed in the tail section of the airplane before the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson, before Godfrey McHugh assumed guard over the casket during the swearing in at 2:38, before the Irish wake during the flight when they all got drunk and sat around the casket, before anybody was back there with it, that the body was removed from the casket, taken out the starboard aft galley door, put on the arms of a forklift, lowered to the ground, and put in one of the luggage compartments of the airplane, forward or aft luggage compartment. There are other reasons to believe that. I'm not going to go into them today, but Jamie Sawa, a great JFK researcher, took a series of immaculate photographs of the forward and aft luggage compartments in 2003 at the Air Force Museum. And there was room in both luggage compartments for luggage as well as for a body. There was more room up forward, but a lot of that was taken up by radio equipment. There was room in the aft luggage compartment, which would have been right below the tail, for a long, narrow storage, much longer than a human body. So there was room to do this. So that's the Lifton theory of how the Dallas casket would have been empty when it was offloaded from the airplane. But now there's another possibility, and I'm just going to give you the bare bones of it. Sean Fetter, a researcher who wrote a book I'm very critical of, and I wrote a devastating book review of his book, Under Cover of Night. Like any book, not everything in the book is bad and not everything is wrong. So you can read all the JFK assassination books, 300 or 400 of them. And even the worst books have something of value in them somewhere. even if by accident. So, a stopped clock is correct twice a day. So, so even terrible authors get some things right. So this Sean Fetter says in his book, Under Cover of Night, he says that he found two credible witnesses to a different casket, not the bronze casket taken on board at 214. A different casket, a simpler casket, loaded onto the airplane at least a half an hour before that. And his witnesses seemed to be credible witnesses. The pilot of Air Force Two, as I recall, I'm doing this from memory, and the head stewardess on the Pan American press plane parked at Love Field. So they told him stories, he says in his book. They gave him interviews about seeing a simpler casket loaded on the airplane long before this casket arrived from Parkland Hospital. And if that's true, then Kennedy's body could have been spirited out of Parkland earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And then it would have been easier to put it in a luggage compartment directly from ground transportation, because luggage was being transferred from Air Force Two to Air Force One. Lyndon wanted all of his luggage transferred. And so the luggage bays were open. And so that would have made it easier to just transfer the body if it arrived earlier, and it really was never in the bronze casket. And so the problem here, I'll end this up with the problem and why there's so much uncertainty, is that Aubrey Reich was the hearse and ambulance driver for O'Neill Funeral Home in Dallas. And he says that he placed Kennedy's body wrapped in sheets. He didn't see the face. The body wrapped in a sheet, the head wrapped in a sheet. He and his assistant, Peanuts, placed Kennedy's body in the bronze Dallas casket. His boss, Vernon O'Neill, closed the lid, and they never opened it after that until it was at Love Field and went up the steps. He didn't think it was opened. If he's right about that, then Lifton was right, and it had to be in that casket, and it had to be removed between 2:18 p.m. and 2:30, between the time Jackie went on board and hid herself in the bedroom to compose herself and the time the judge arrived, which is 2:30. So, but it's not over. Sean Fetter says he found a steward on the airplane whose duty was to stay in the aft galley compartment. And he says that steward told him the Dallas bronze casket, the 400-pound monster, was never opened before takeoff. It was never opened after it was brought on board at 2:18. If that's correct, then Sean Fetter has to be right, and JFK's body went on board the airplane earlier, and that means they didn't have to do some really dangerous, risky thing and stick it out of a door 25 feet above the ground and put it on two arms of a forklift and move it down and hope nobody would see that. They just took it out of a ground vehicle and put it in a luggage bay, and there wouldn't have been almost anybody paying attention at that point. So there are two possibilities for how it was taken out of that bronze casket. One possibility is in the tail section of the airplane, and that's why Kellerman would say, I'll have to call you back after the body, because something was going on with the body for him to say that. And he said that between 2:18 and 2:30. We know that for a fact. So that remark of his would tend to support the Lifton hypothesis. But the things that Sean Fetter has reported on, if the interviews he reports are accurate, if he's not making them up, if the witnesses were reliable, then his version has to be correct, which is that the body arrived earlier than that. And that's why, and it didn't arrive at 2:14 in that heavy casket. It arrived half an hour or 40 minutes earlier. And so there's one witness that might corroborate Sean Fetter, and that's Nathan Poole, the Otis elevator man who co-discovered the stretcher bullet at Parkland with Darrell Tomlinson. He was the co-discoverer. So he's interviewed by the House committee in the mid 70s or late 70s. And he tells them that he saw a body removed from trauma room 1 on a gurney, and it was covered with a purple shroud, and that he assumed it was JFK's body. So that's totally contrary to the story of JFK's body leaving in the bronze casket. And the trouble is, what is this about a purple shroud? It sounds bizarre, but that's what the guy remembered. And then the House committee either altered his deposition transcript or they changed the subject, because all of a sudden the whole subject of the next question changed. But he thinks JFK's body left trauma room 1 early, And of course, there are rumors, or there's been testimony that the Secret Service was asking hospital administrators, is there a secret way out of the hospital? And apparently, I think it was Mr. Price told them, yeah, we have underground tunnels. There is a way to get out of here in secret. So I don't know which of those two is true. One of them is true. I would like to see Sean Fetter provide tape recordings of his witness interviews of the steward, of the Pan Am chief lady stewardess, and of the pilot of Air Force Two from when he did those interviews, probably some time ago. And let me hear them talk about this so I can assess their credibility. But he didn't produce a transcript, and I want to hear the tape recordings.
Did you and Rick ever speak to the comment about the early reports related to the potentially deceased Secret Service agent?
We haven't discussed it, Rick and I, yet. We're about to discuss a lot of things later this summer because Rick wants to. And I said, please, let's wait till the end of the summer. I got a major project coming out. I'm working on it 24/7. So we're going to discuss a lot of issues later this summer. The old morgue versus the new morgue, Reeby versus Dennis David, all kinds of issues. David Lifton wrote about the wire service report of a dead Secret Service agent in Dallas.
That's what I'm referring to. Yeah.
And so it was on the wire. It was. I don't know what it means. And so therefore, there was a dead Secret Service agent reported, and I don't know what it means. I don't know if it was an accurate report or not. I know what David Lifton wanted it to mean, and I'm not going to go into that today either because it's a wild theory that I do not subscribe to whatsoever. So anyway, I think you told me earlier, maybe this is a good time to segue. What was my relationship ultimately between Lifton and his theories, and which ones of them do I support today and which ones do I not support? Which ones did I fall away from and end up not supporting? And I would love to answer that question.
Doug, in the past, you've been labeled a Liftonite. That is someone subscribing to the theories of the author David Lifton in his book, Best Evidence. How do you respond to that?
Thank you so much for asking me that question. Because I've been tarred and feathered and misrepresented for years as a Liftonite, as if I was a member of a cult and as if I believed everything he ever said. And maybe part of that's my own fault because we met once in Washington, D.C., and I put pictures of him at the National Archives in my book, in my illustration section. And I talked a lot in the beginning of my book about some of the questions he raised about the head wounds, why were they so different between Parkland and the autopsy photos? Why were the head wounds so different between the Parkland observations and the autopsy photos and what the autopsy doctors said? And also, things of that nature. And so the main question he raised in his book was JFK's head wound, and for that matter, was the throat wound, which was originally a round puncture, inward puncture. Originally, it didn't look like a gash. It didn't look like a wide gash like in the postmortem photographs. So were those two things altered before the autopsy began? Lifton's original questions were okay. Were they altered before the autopsy began? The head wounds, to expand the head wound to 5 times its original surface area, to 5 times its original size, from an egg-sized or orange-sized wound here to the entire top of the head and right side being missing. Where did that change take place? Where did the throat wound change take place? And so he wanted to know, were they altered by somebody before the autopsy began at 8 o'clock? And the trouble with his hypothesis, as you keep reading his book, and I've read it now 4 times. I read it twice in 1981, and I read it twice more in 1992, right after Stone's movie came out. The problem for him is that he became convinced that wounds were altered before the body arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and that the brain was actually removed before the body arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And I not only found this hard to believe, but I found proof that it's demonstrably wrong. It's wrong. It could not have happened. And so the evidence I put in my book that distance myself from his explanation of where wounds were altered was that there are three witnesses to, actually four. There's four witnesses to Kennedy arriving with the same wounds that he had when he left Parkland. So the first witness is Tom Robinson of the Gallers Funeral Home mortician, who drew who drew a picture of a round hole in the back of the head for both the House Select Committee and the review board. And although his hole is center line, it's in the middle of the back of the head. It's not over on the right rear side like most of the other people who draw diagrams. It's still the back of the head. Okay. So, and then for his review board drawing, Robinson drew dotted lines above and below the round hole. And we said, what are the dotted lines in your diagram? And he said, that's where the doctors had to saw the skull open to get the brain out. So that means, all by itself, he's a witness to Kennedy arriving with the same head wound he had when he left Parkland Hospital, a blowout in the back of the head. And he's a witness to seeing doctors at Bethesda, after the bodies arrived at Bethesda, saw the skull open to remove the brain. So the second witness who has confirmed that the body arrived in the same condition and that the brain was still inside is Captain Canada. Captain Canada was the head of the treatment hospital at Bethesda. His counterpart was Captain Stover, who was the head of the medical school. So Captain Canada told researcher Michael Kurtz years ago that, Kennedy had a classic avulsed exit wound in the right rear of his skull. And he described the dimensions of it and that it was in the right rear of the skull. And it was avulsed, which means it exploded from the inside out in the right rear of his head. And Kurtz said to him, do you realize you're contradicting the Warren report? And Canada told Kurtz, according to Kurtz, Canada told him, well, of course, that was part of the cover-up. So then Canada said, I don't want you to publish what I told you about this until 25 years after my death.
That's interesting. That's
so
really
apparently, Kurtz honored that request either fully or in part, because he didn't publish this until 2006 in his book about the assassination. So he published this quote from Canada, but it's proving that Kennedy had the same wound they saw at Parkland and that the brain is still in the head. He didn't say the top of the head was gone. He said the right rear of the head was blown out. And his description of it was really smaller than other people's. It was like the size of a large egg or a very small orange. It wasn't the massive size in the diagram in Josiah Thompson's book. It was smaller than that, but it was still an exit wound.
Jeez.
So the third witness to this, that he arrived with the same wound, is Dr. Ebersol. And I think that's why the House Select Committee, which is part of a cover-up, as I see it now, that's why they suppress his testimony, because he looked at the back of the head photo with the back of the head intact, and he said, no, this doesn't look right. And he says, I remember more of a gaping occipital wound. So he's saying he remembers an occipital wound, but he doesn't agree with the photo that shows the top of the head opened up and the right temporal bone flapped out. He doesn't agree with what the photo shows, but he says, no, I saw a gaping occipital wound. So the fourth witness would be Admiral Berkeley, a conflicted individual who seems to have controlled the photography of the autopsy. He was sending people off to develop photos the very next morning. Robert Knudsen and others go develop these photos. I assume he controlled the culling of the collection, which photos were destroyed or suppressed, which ones will be put in the record. That I assume he controlled all that. So Berkeley, in his later years, told two authors that Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy. I don't agree with the number of headshots in the Warren Commission, which was one. And he had an exit wound in the back of his head. And the people he told were Henry Hurt and the same Michael Kurtz. So when they called him back afterwards to talk about it some more, he says, I don't want to talk to you anymore. It's too sensitive. I don't want to talk. And he hung up on him. So this is a guy who, by saying there was an exit wound in the back of the head, is essentially confirming that Kennedy arrived at Bethesda with the same wound he left Parkland with. So that's 4 reasons that David Lifton had to be wrong. That no, the body wasn't altered. None of the wounds were altered before it arrived at Parkland. I'm sorry. So these 4 reasons are why David Lifton was wrong in his hypothesis when he hypothesized in his book that and he continued to do so in subsequent years, that his belief, even at the time of his death, as far as I know, was he still believed that the body had been tampered with and wounds had been altered to get the evidence out before JFK's body arrived at Bethesda. And so those are the 4 reasons why I say he's definitely wrong. Those are unimpeachable reasons, as far as I'm concerned. And of course, I don't believe the brain was removed either. And so poor Sean Fetter, in his book, he describes Roy Kellerman as an axe murderer who takes the crash axe from the cockpit of Air Force One and destroys Kennedy's head and removes his brain in the luggage compartment, and who hacks open the throat wound and turns it into a gash and all this. And so I think Lifton was wrong that wounds were altered before Bethesda. He was wrong that the brain was removed before Bethesda. And I think he's wrong about one other thing. Boswell made the famous sketch of the top of JFK's head at the autopsy. And that sketch is on the back of the body chart. It's on the back of the autopsy descriptive sheet, which has the body charts and the organ weights on the front. On the back, it has Boswell's sketch. So that sketch shows the entire top of the head missing, all the bone missing. And he draws a dotted line around the missing bone, and he says 10 by 17 missing. And he explained to the House Committee, Forensic Pathology Panel, and he explained to the review board under oath, yes, that document means that's where all the bone was missing, the entire top of the head, and it looks like part of the right side is missing. And those were the dimensions of the missing area, 10 by 17 centimeters. And so Lifton wanted to believe that that was evidence that somebody else tampered with the body before it arrived at Bethesda, and that Boswell's recording important evidence in what someone else did, some profane act carried out by someone else before JFK's body arrived at Bethesda. And I don't view it that way. I view that as a con job. That's gaslighting. So that's the one set of notes that Humes didn't destroy. He said he destroyed all the notes to prevent them from becoming more items of morbid curiosity because they were bloodstained. That has bloodstains all over it, and he didn't destroy that. And we asked him, why didn't you destroy this set of notes? And he had no answer. And Boswell volunteered without us asking him, I don't know why we didn't destroy that one. Well, I know why. That's gaslighting. They want the people that look at that diagram to think that Kennedy arrived in that condition with the top of his head missing. The condition you see now in the postmortem photographs. They want you to believe he arrived that way. He didn't arrive that way. That's what Humes did. And Boswell witnessed him doing it before 8 o'clock. And that's why the chain of custody of the body being broken is so important. And that's what Ed Reed and Tom Robinson witnessed Dr. Humes doing. So by making a sketch of it and leaving it in the record, Boswell and Humes are trying to misrepresent the autopsy photos as the way Kennedy looked when he arrived. BS. No way. Because Dr. Curtis, at the hearing I testified at, Dr. Curtis stated I want to correct myself. So Dr. Curtis, who testified at the hearing where I appeared, he gave an earlier interview to Larry Schnapp, which Larry Schnapp posted online shortly after Dr. Curtis testified. And so Dr. Curtis told Larry Schnapp a few years ago that those autopsy photographs that show the top of the head gone are not what the body looked like at Parkland Hospital. That's not the way he looked at all. And so I know that. And we specifically asked Dr. Crenshaw and Nurse Bell when we went to Texas to interview people the Warren Commission failed to interview. Was the top of the head gone at Parkland Hospital? Was it all missing and torn up? And they both said, no. And they looked at us like, why are you asking me that? They both said, no. They said there was a lot of blood everywhere. But no, it wasn't missing or opened up. And so that corroborates what Don Curtis said to Larry Schnapp. And that's the game that Humes and Boswell were up to. So Lifton wanted to believe that Humes and Boswell discovered illicit clandestine surgery done by somebody else before JFK arrived. And he's totally wrong about all that. And when I tried to persuade him that he was wrong in a spirit of collegiality, and he refused to accept the facts, is when we stopped talking to each other, which was about the year 2000. We didn't have much contact after that. So the things that I think he did that were good was that he refocused the attention of the research community on the head wounds. He said, stop focusing solely on the single bullet theory. It's already been beat to death in so many words, and it's already been disproven eloquently by Cyril Wecht and others. It doesn't work. And it's an invention by the Warren Commission, by Owen Spector, because he had too many wounds and not enough bullets to account for the wounds. So he had to invent something. And so he said, focus on the head wounds because they appear to have changed between Bethesda, So he said, focus on the head wounds. They appear to have changed between Parkland and Bethesda. So that refocusing was a good thing. And his work with the multiple casket entries and the broken chain of custody on the body, I thought was very good then. And I still think today that it was very good, with one minor exception. So those are the two things I credit him for today. And so because I mentioned him favorably in my book about having us refocus on the head wounds, and that he was asking the right question, but that he came up with the wrong answer. So in my book, I say he's asking the right question. Were wounds tampered with? Was the size and location of these wounds altered before the autopsy record began? That was the right question. The answer he came up with was wrong. And part of the wrong answer was that he thought the body was not only tampered with before Bethesda, he posited some elaborate reconstructive surgery where somebody altered all these wounds and took out the bullets, and they somehow put the head back together to fool the X-ray machine and to fool the camera. That's nonsense. What I'm telling you, once the skull was altered by clandestine surgery before 8 o'clock, it stayed that way. You can't fix something like that. You can't do clandestine reconstructive surgery to fix a huge top of the head missing and fool the camera and fool the X-ray machine. That's just absolute nonsense. So those are the basic things that he got wrong. And those are the things where I've differed with him. And this is all part of a process. Him coming up with a lot of good questions and only a few good answers, and coming up with some of the wrong answers. So me building on his work and saying, oh, some of his work was good, but he came up with a lot of answers that I can't accept. And here's my different answers to the same questions. And other people are continuing this work in different areas today. And that's why we still have podcasts and lively discussions, but it's how to connect the dots. But I'm just telling you that. So I'm not a member of a cult. I talked to him a lot between 1996 and 2000. Just like Jeremy Gunn and David Marwell were talking to the entire research community. They were talking to everybody, including David Lifton. Jeremy talked to him a lot. And so yes, I gave him some credit in my book for asking the right questions. And I said he came up with the wrong answers, basically. And it's my great disappointment that David Lifton still never accepted the work of David Mantik. So he wouldn't accept the fact that all 3 surviving skull X-rays are altered copy films. He wouldn't accept the light blasting of those images in a dark room. He wanted to still believe, when he died, as far as I know, he still wanted to believe that the head had been reconstructed and to fool the X-ray machine in the camera. That's just nonsense. And he wanted to believe that Humes and Boswell discovered tampering with the body that somebody else had done before it arrived at Bethesda. And I think that's nonsense. And so that's my long answer to the story about David Lifton. And so, our relationship was mixed, and at one point it terminated, and that's the way it goes. I said this at the beginning, different researchers assign different weight to different evidence. Different researchers say some evidence is not even credible, much less not that important. It's not even credible. Other researchers say, oh, it's not only credible, it's very important. So that's why you have disagreements among experts. And people connect the dots differently. Even when they agree that all this is real evidence, they'll connect the dots differently. So that's why it remains the enduring American obsession, this case, partially because of government lies and deception and suppression, and partially because different people interpret the same evidence in different ways. And so I've always likened the case, this is how I would conclude my thoughts today, I guess. I've likened this case to a jigsaw puzzle with 1,000 pieces, where 500 pieces have been thrown away and substituted with fake pieces from a different puzzle. And then we poor researchers have been trying for decades to put the case together with jigsaw pieces, and half of them are missing and or the wrong pieces from the wrong puzzle. And that was done on purpose to confuse the nation. But that ballgame is over. Based on my testimony, I provided all the reasons why people should not have any confidence in the Warren report, and why they should have a lot of questions about the HSCA conclusions of the forensic pathology panel. And that was my goal in my testimony. And I'm very grateful that Congresswoman Luna allowed me to do that.
Well, I just hope you start referring to it as JFK, the enduring secret, because that's what it is over the years.
Right. That's right. Well put. These are why it is an enduring secret, is half of the puzzle pieces were thrown away and substituted falsely on purpose. And the rest is just destruction and suppression and intentional lies by the national security state. I listened to Jeffrey Sachs, the great American economist and humanitarian, in his interview with Jefferson Morley the other night. It's fantastic. He spoke at a conference I was at in 2017, and he spoke about his wonderful book, To Move the World, about the peace speech. But he didn't talk about the assassination at that time. He wasn't ready. And he didn't talk about the reasons for Kennedy's death. He just talked about the primacy of that speech and how Kennedy was trying to change all of American foreign policy and end the Cold War. In his podcast interview less than a week ago with Jefferson Morley, you can access it on JFK Facts, he did the full Monty. He's been reading and thinking a lot. And he says, we had a coup in this country. I didn't used to believe it, but I've grown up, and I'm a grown up now. We had a coup in this country. It was a national security cover up, a coup, whatever you want to call it. We've been lied to. The national security state lies from morning till night. And he said, this is what really happened. And he said, that's why what happened to Kennedy was even more tragic. He was right on the cusp of changing the entire course of the Cold War, of coming close to trying to end the Cold War, because the test ban treaty would have been followed by some first initial disarmament treaty, and then Kennedy was going to go to Moscow to sign the treaty. And the rapprochement with Castro, which he was attempting to accomplish in secret, I'm sure the CIA and the NSA knew all about it. I'm sure they hated Kennedy for it. If that had succeeded, it would have meant that the Russians would have been kicked out of Cuba, and that Castro would have been neutral, and we would have lifted the embargo. And so the whole world would have changed if there had been a second term for Kennedy. And that's what these people, the coup plotters and the cabal, did not want. And of course, Kennedy was going to pull out of Vietnam. As Jeffrey Sachs said, that's not a theory. That's not a myth. It's an established fact. It's well understood. He issued the orders in NSAM 263 to withdraw from Vietnam, and it was going to be done by the end of 65. And so he mentioned all these things. He didn't pull any punches this time. And I'm very proud of his growth, as an historian who wants to tell the truth now about the peace speech and the full context of the peace speech, which is what he did with Jeff Morley. So kudos to Jeffrey Sachs.
The last couple of quick questions. You've been operating in dangerous territory for a long time. I mean, there's a lot of people who have feared for their life and have felt that they were in danger, especially in the early stages of this investigation years ago now. Have you ever felt that in the middle of any of this?
I didn't feel physical danger, but I felt extreme anxiety and fear of, I knew I was being messed with. So I was sending all my chapters of my book after working on it off and on for almost a decade and writing 3 years, 3.5 years full time every weekend, every night. My email was being messed with. I was sending all my draft chapters to Rex Bradford, who runs the Mary Farrell Foundation. And the initial idea was that he would publish it for me. They would publish it. And then he changed his mind later and decided, you should self-publish this. And so I won't go into the reasons for that, but he decided, why don't you self-publish it? I'll show you how. I'll format all your chapters and I'll do the PDF uploads to the company called CreateSpace, which was bought out by Amazon by the time I was ready to publish. So I didn't know how to do all that, to self-publish and upload your content to the self-publishing company. He was doing all that for me, but I had to send him my draft chapters for him to do that. And so somebody cut off all my email service early in 2009. And it was gone for 3 days, and I could tell it wasn't coming back. So I called the company, Verizon. I'm going to name them, okay? I'm going to name names. And I talked to a tech in the Philippines who told the truth because they were remotely located. And they didn't know what had happened. And they said, oh, your computer password, the way it talks to the server has been changed. I said, what do you mean password? They said, oh, no, it's not the password I said, is this the one I enter every day to log on? They said, no. That's your user password to get onto your computer. They said, your computer has a machine password with the server that Verizon uses. And somebody went in and changed your password, the way your IP address talks to the server. And they said, not only that, they've changed the password inside your modem in your house. And it took them 3 hours to figure this out. And they did all the troubleshooting and they figured it out. Well, I was scared when that happened because I thought somebody knows the content of my book and they're not going to want it published. That's what I was afraid of.
Mm-hmm.
So this happened again 6 months later in the summer of 2009. And this time I said, okay, fool me once, but you're not going to fool me twice. So I canceled I called the tech and they said, yes, that's what's happened. So it happened again. Somebody changed the machine password between my IP address, my home computer, and the server, and somebody messed with my modem, the password in my modem. So I canceled the service at Verizon, and I went with Gmail. And then I bought a new laptop, and this is the end of the story. I put the new laptop, I plugged it in, I plugged in the Ethernet cable, and up pops an ad that says it's from Verizon. We miss you. We want you back. And it looked like a normal commercial ad to me, but I thought it was really strange that was the first thing I saw, even before I set up my computer. And so then the computer put up a warning after that, a warning screen. It said, warning, the security certificate for this page has failed. Someone does not match the security certificate for this page and is impersonating the user that they claim to be and maybe stealing your content. I thought, oh my God. So I did screenshots of these 2 pages, the welcome back to Verizon message and the warning from Dell. And I took them into the IT specialist where I worked at the passport office. And I told her this story. And I said, what are the chances of these password problems happening? It's just one of those things, shit happens. Things happen sometimes. Things get corrupted. And she goes, the chances of that happening? Zero. She said, 0. And she said, somebody's been stealing the content of all your book chapters all year. And she said, and so they've been going to the fake Verizon site and they've been stealing whatever they wanted, reading all your emails with your colleagues, and then sending them on to whoever it was you were sending them to, like Rex Bradford. And that scared the hell out of me because I thought my book would not get published. I thought Amazon would say, sorry, Mr. Horne, your book's too controversial. You can't say things like this about the US government. But it didn't happen. It got published. And so thank God for, for Amazon buying CreateSpace and for them just, they just wanted to make the money. So they published the book. So that's my one story about the times when I was scared. I was scared that publication would be blocked, but it wasn't. So it had a happy ending. I've had a lot of phone calls disconnected by third parties as soon as I start talking about the Kennedy assassination.
Really?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Loud clicking noises that are not inadvertent. They're obnoxious. They're like intentionally obnoxious, because I'm told if your phone is tapped nowadays, you're not supposed to even be aware of it. But loud clicking noises. And whenever I start talking about this subject, more than about 30 minutes, or getting into the medical evidence or the Zapruder film, the calls will be disconnected. And so I just persist, as Elizabeth Warren would say. I persist, and I call the person back, and they call me back, and we just keep talking anyway. And we tell the people doing it, you can go to hell. We're going to keep having our conversation. So those are the two types of things that have happened to me, but I've never felt physically in danger, just extremely irritated. And once I was worried that I wouldn't be able to publish, but it worked out okay.
No, that's good to hear. I'm glad to hear that that's actually, the answer that you're providing, and not something worse, for sure.
Yeah.
This has been great. I don't, we're kind of at the end. I think, Rick, do you have, you've been super silent. Do you have anything that you think you'd like Doug to mention or talk about?
No, I think I think you covered all the bases, and I think that the last couple of things Doug was talking about is a great way to end it.
Yeah, I do too.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Rick. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, we, Doug,
Thank you very much, Jeff and Rick, but I'll say especially Jeff, thank you for the enduring secret, JFK, the enduring secret. And I'm just glad that, my intermittent retirement, I keep getting burned out on the case. I keep getting frustrated with trolls, or, people that are nasty about the way they disagree with me. I keep getting frustrated with that. And occasionally I say, I'm retired. I'm retired again. I'm not doing this anymore. But I came out of retirement early in 2023 for a number of reasons, and I've stayed active since then. So I don't know how long this will last, but right now I'm really glad you got me on board. And so what I need to do now is listen to some of your earlier podcasts, which I know you're going to send to me, and I'll increase what I know about the case by doing that. So thank you both very much.
thank you, Doug. It's been an absolute pleasure. We are privileged to have you on today, and I think when this gets out and so many people get a chance to listen to what you've been saying for many, many, many years, but have it be in this venue, I think you'll continue to influence the American people on what really they should be thinking about in this case, and get them all closer to understanding the truth of it all.
I would like to agree with that. Not everybody wants to read a 5-volume memoir full of technical information. 4 volumes are full of technical information, and most of my 5th volume is about the Cold War politics of the Cold War, and it reads like something Jeffrey Sachs would write, today. But that's a long book to read, over 1,800 pages of text, and I wasn't able to do an index. I didn't want to work on it another 6 months, so that's not everybody's cup of tea. So it's great to be able to teach these things and to teach my conclusions in a different venue. So it's wonderful to hear me talk about it, I hope, and tell a few war stories that illustrate the points I'm making. So it's great. And so I just couldn't be more pleased. And thanks again.
I was not being dramatic in episode 1 when I said that Doug Horne was an American hero. He is an American hero. I'm confident that when we get to the end of this journey related to the JFK assassination and we're sizing it all up, Doug Horne will have ample currency on the proper side of the ledger to be at peace with what he has dedicated a large part of his life to, finding the truth in one of the most complicated places to look for it. And he's helped all of us to do just that as well. Not just the handful of us that study the case, but the greater we in We the People. So thank you, Doug, on behalf of those that know and those that will never know, but are the recipients of your dividend of truth. For those of you who have not seen or heard the entire testimony of Doug Horne at the Congressional Committee, I would urge you to do so. It's available on the web, and we'll leave a link in the show notes as well. But just to make it a little bit easier, if you haven't listened already, I'm going to summarize the problems with the autopsy that were pointed out by Doug Horne in his testimony. First, there were 8 different sets of autopsy photographs known to have been taken that are not in the official collection today and never have been. They include the following. First, an overhead wide shot of JFK's body taken from atop a stepladder. Second, a photograph of a large bruise atop the right lung, taken inside the chest after the lungs were removed. Next, an entrance wound in the lower right of the skull with scalp reflected, taken from the outside. And there's another photograph of that same entrance wound in the lower right portion of the skull, taken from inside the cranium after the brain was removed. There's a photo of the condition of the back of the head after the embalming and reconstruction was completed, and still showing an exit defect that could not be closed. There are negatives missing from a black and white film pack showing metal probes in JFK's body. There are black and white prints showing a large exit defect in the rear of JFK's head. There are other black and white prints and at least one color positive transparency showing a small entry wound high in the forehead above the corner of JFK's right eye. Some autopsy photos in the official collection at the National Archives are in gross disagreement with the head and neck wounds universally observed by treating physicians at Parkland Hospital on November 22, 1963, and recorded in their notes and in their 1964 testimony. At least 2 and possibly 3 JFK skull x-rays exposed at Bethesda Naval Hospital are missing, and they have never been in the official collection. These missing x-rays were purportedly oblique views of the back of the head, shot at an angle which would have clearly imaged the large exit defect in the right rear of the head. The radiologist at JFK's autopsy, Dr. Ebersol, confirmed that 6 skull x-rays were taken, although only 3 are in the archives today. Next, the science of optical densitometry reveals that all 3 surviving skull x-rays are not originals, but rather they are altered copy films. Dr. David Mantic, through 9 visits to the National Archives, uncovered clear evidence of alteration, including hiding the blowout in the right rear of the skull, the blowout that was seen at Parkland Hospital. And how did they do it? They used a white patch on the lateral x-rays and a fake bullet fragment photographically imposed on the anterior-posterior skull x-ray. This fake fragment is impossibly dense. It does not appear on lateral x-rays, and it was not seen on the original x-rays by 2 of the 3 autopsy physicians. And no fragment of that size, that is 6.5 millimeters, was removed from JFK's skull, according to sworn testimony. 2 qualified medical doctors, Dr. David W. Mantic and Dr. Michael Chesser, who accessed the autopsy materials, agree that the extant JFK skull x-rays reveal unambiguous evidence of 2 headshots fired from in front of the president. That's right, fired from in front of the president. And that is contrary to the Warren Commission and HSCA findings. The x-rays actually reveal a total of 3 headshots, 1 from behind and 2 from the front. Dr. Chesser located the 2 frontal entry wounds on the lateral skull x-rays. Next, we'll talk about the Harper fragment. The Harper fragment was a portion of a skull bone, a crucial item of evidence that has been missing since late 1963. If you want to learn more about that, find my episode on it at JFK, The Enduring Secret. Next, there were bullet fragments known to have been removed from President Kennedy's body at Bethesda Naval Hospital that were never placed into the official record, and they are still missing today. Next, the remains of President Kennedy's brain are still missing today. The brain, following its examination, was placed into a stainless steel container in 1963, and that container, along with an original signed autopsy report, was transferred to Senator Robert F. Kennedy in April of 1965. These materials were not among those returned to the U.S. government by RFK on October 31st, 1966. RFK's attorney, Burke Marshall, stated to the HSCA that RFK had made these materials permanently inaccessible. The 14 brain photographs in the National Archives today cannot be and are not photos of John F. Kennedy's brain. They have been impugned by the official photographer at the brain examination and by one of the FBI agents present at JFK's autopsy. A timeline analysis revealed 2 brain exams of different brains, 1 week apart. JFK's brain was autopsied on Monday, November 25, 1963, and a substitute medical school brain was examined on December 2, 1963. The photographs of JFK's brain from the November 25th examination never made it into the official record. The photographs in the archives are of the substitute brain and have been disowned by the official photographer, John Stringer, and FBI agent Francis O'Neill, and that's based on their sworn testimony. The substitute brain photos exhibit too much mass and are on the wrong type of film. Furthermore, the extreme damage to the right cerebellum seen at Parkland Hospital is not present in the brain photographs in the archives. In fact, those photographs show no damage to either side of the cerebellum. Next, the chain of custody of President Kennedy's body prior to the start of the autopsy clearly appears to have been broken, casting doubt on the reliability of the official autopsy report. Next, the Navy pathologists arrived at 4 sets of differing conclusions about President Kennedy's wounds and how he died, and they did so within 2 weeks after his death. The official autopsy report in the National Archives represents only the 4th and final set of conclusions, a fact that Doug Horne deems, and I quote, patently unacceptable. The existing deed of gift from the Kennedy family, dated October 29, 1966, sets severe restrictions on who can view the JFK autopsy materials and how they can be used, resulting in their de facto suppression. Doug Horne asserts this deed of gift needs to be re-examined and lifted to allow qualified experts free and unlimited access to definitively resolve questions about the authenticity of that evidence.